What do you do with your religion if you found out that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Moses ever existed? See, now we have Jewish scholars coming out and saying that Moses never existed. There's no archaeological record of his existence. In a minute, we're going to listen to a lecture and an interview done by a gentleman interviewing a scholar by the name of Gad Bernier. Gad Bernier is a profound historian who's going to say that there is no archaeological record that Moses ever existed. See, one thing you gotta know is history. And once you find out the truth about history, you will see why there's so much allegory in the Bible and why the Bible is an allegorical book. You see what I'm saying? It's a very intricate process that you have to go through when you're studying these things. Now, the Old Testament is a compilation of the first 5 books that are said to have been written by Moses, right? And then you have books that came after it. A book, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Nehemiah, Malachi, all these particular books came later. But once you find out in history that over time, these books were added to give historical validity that is not sound. You see what I'm saying? Basically, what I have found out is that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, illustrates a history of people, Semitic people to be exact, in their interactions with ancient Egyptians, right? Now, before they became Semitic, these are Indo-European people that we're talking about, right? Who came into Africa, developed a culture by absorbing the laws, statutes, and ordinances and the ways of life of the Egyptians, kicked out, and then developing their own way of life, right? And then turned it around on the Africans and said they were enslaved or they were in bondage for 400 years when it's historically not true. There is no Exodus the way it is spoke of in the Bible, headed by Moses and a person named Aaron, who was said to be his spokesman. Because remember, Moses, even though it said he was learned in all of the wisdom of the Egyptian, that right there tells you what was actually going on. Now, there is a book of the Bible called the Book of Jasher. It's also called Sefer HaYasa Literature. Now, this particular book is the blueprint of the Old Testament. Now, the Book of Jasher is what is called an apocryphal book. It's not in the 66 books of the Bible. It's called a non-canonical book, right? Which means it's not in the canon. You see what I'm saying? This book, Sefer HaYasa Literature, is the Book of Jasher, and it encompasses Genesis to Deuteronomy, right? Genesis to Deuteronomy is the book of the law, right? And it's also called the Septuagint. This is the Greek Old Testament, and it's also called the Pentateuch. And this Pentateuch was given to Christian believers, right? It was given to them on purpose, right? To indoctrinate them to have love for the Jews and admiration for the Jews because they were said to be God's chosen people. Now, this is the true history, okay? Now, the person who wrote Sefer HaYasa Literature, which means Book of the Upright Ones, according to Dr. Walter Williams, Sefer means book, Ha means of, Yasser, the upright ones. Translated into English, the book of Jasher. Right? Okay, so this particular book was written by a historical person who actually did exist around the time of the 11th century. I think it was around 1080 to 1100. This is what Dr. Walter Williams says. I did do some research. He did exist. This person was a Lombard, right? He wrote the blueprint of the Old Testament, which is Sefer HaYasser literature. I have the book, right? This book has Genesis up to Deuteronomy, and it has the stories that the first 5 books of Moses has in the regular Old Testament that's in your Bible. You see what I'm saying? But this book is said to be apocryphal. Now that's strategic. That is a strategic move that the authors made. And this book was inserted into European society during the Renaissance era, right? The age of learning, when the vast amounts of Europeans learned to read and write. Okay, so this guy by the name of Solomon Bar Isaac, called Rashi, was this profound Jewish scholar who created the blueprint of the Old Testament. Now, when we get to this video, you have a professor by the name of Gad Bernea. He's going to clearly tell you that Moses never existed. And when you can basically eliminate the historical existence, archaeological existence of Moses, then you have no Abrahamic religion, because Moses is the one writing about Abraham. You see what I'm saying? Check this out.
Archaeology is there is simply nothing about Moses or an exodus of a people out of Egypt from archaeological data. It became clear that there is no, not just no mention, but the slightest hint of any knowledge of the Pentateuch in general, not just Moses and the Exodus, but the Pentateuch or the Bible, anywhere before the 4th century, the end of the 4th century BCE.
What you're saying is there's nothing in Babylon, Judea, and Elephantine that signals or gives any hint, no whiff of awareness of what we see in the Pentateuch. How significant is that? Is this just an argument from silence, or should we have expectations of something?
You know, the argument from silence, the silence is so deafening when you combine the Persian period and the early Hellenistic period, which is the period we're talking about. There's about 5,000 sources. In Samaria, we have the Wadi Dalia papyri, which are very important. And it is absolutely clear that he did not know of a Moses. Because if Moses was there, clearly the church fathers will have mentioned it. Okay, that's absolute certainty that this would not have been gone down in silence.
Give me the scientific external data that anchors the concept you're pointing at that proves this must have a date in the 7th century, 6th century BCE, pre-exile.
Again, there is simply no evidence outside the Bible for any knowledge of the Bible before the end of the 4th century. Before that, nothing. There is no personal name Judah anywhere, for example. That is the one that you would expect. They come from Judea, right? So, you would expect something like that. Nothing. No Moses, no Aaron. As I said, no biblical hero.
No mention of a Pentateuch. No mention of Moses before the 4th century BC. The guy said that not even the church fathers mention of Moses. Now, we already know that there is no church fathers. You see what I'm saying? These church fathers who they're talking about, they made up because the history is the ancient Egyptian Kariheb or Coptic priests are the ones who created Christianity. And it was them debating and creating the Christian religion during the 5 council meetings, beginning with the Council of Nicaea. But why is what he's saying so important? That's where chronology comes in. Because the story of the Exodus is said to have happened during and around what would be considered the 18th dynasty or the 19th dynasty, somewhere in between, right? Where this group of Hebrews was cast out of Egypt by a Pharaoh that knew not Moses. You see what I'm saying? Not a Pharaoh that knew not Moses, but a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph, who is the son of Jacob, right? According to the Bible. Now, why is this important? Why is he saying that there is not a mention of Moses even in the 4th century BCE, right? Because during the time of the 4th century BCE, coming out of the Persian occupation of ancient Africa, you had what he said, the Hellenistic period, which is the Greek era, right? When Alexander the Greek came in and he died in 322, 323 BCE after occupying it around 332, right? His successor was the Ptolemies. The first Ptolemy to take power after after Alexander's administration was the Greek prince Ptolemy Soter. Soter meaning savior. Go get the book Historical Origin of Christianity by Dr. Walter Williams, and you'll get all that laid out. But as a reference of historical fact that is not fact, it said that Ptolemy Philadelphus II was the one who commissioned around the 4th century BCE the 72 Jewish scholars to translate the Torah into Greek, which became your Septuagint Old Testament, or 5 books of the Torah. That's why that's important. But he said they didn't even mention the Torah or Moses. Just 1 second, fam. I'm back. So, during the time of the so-called Exodus, that should already have been documented in history before the 4th century BCE, when the Hellenistic period began to take place. No history, no archaeological record of a Moses or an Exodus. So all of this clearly illustrates the truth that Dr. Walter Williams had put forth to the people about the story of this Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are said to be the upright ones of the Old Testament that Moses is supposed to have written about during the first 5 books. Now, mind you, you have 3 names of the Old Testament. You have the Torah, you have the Pentateuch, and you have the Septuagint. Now, during the 4th century BCE, when the translation was supposed to have taken place by the 72 scholars of Israel, that particular book was named the Septuagint, right? Look it up. This scholar, Jewish scholar, is saying that there was no knowledge of it and there was no record of it. So at what point in time was it written or was it created? I'm telling you, according to the research of Dr. Walter Williams, it was created during the 11th century AD, around 1080 to 1100, by Solomon Bar Isaac, called Rashi, who was a Lombard. And he created the blueprint for Judaism. Get back. The blueprint for Judaism by creating Sefer HaYasa literature. And then his grandson, Jacob Ben Meir, who was a writer of appendix. What is an appendix? An appendix is simply a way or a way of writing in the manner of an outline. And this is how your Bible is compiled. Like, for instance, for example, John 3, chapter 3, the 16th verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. John 3:16. That's the way you write an appendix so that you can go and find the particular scripture. See, the Torah is not written that way. The Jews, the way they teach their people is that you memorize the book. You read it and you memorize it, but it's not read in appendix form. It's not compiled in appendix form, especially during that particular time period. I really don't know how it's written now, but then it wasn't. But now, that's how it is. But Jacob Ben Meir, who is another so-called, or what is called Tosafot writer, which is a writer of appendix. Look it up. Dr. Walter Williams did a marvelous job presenting this information to the people. You see what I'm saying? He began to add an appendix to his grandfather's writing, who is Solomon Bar Isaac, the mastermind. You see what I'm saying? And this particular literature of the Torah did not come into existence until the 11th century AD. It was created. This is where your allegory comes in. Why even write this literature? Why even write this so-called history using people who never existed? Where is the truth? The truth is in the historical record of the happenings between the Indo-Europeans, who are the Khazarian and Ashkenazi Jews, right? Who came into the land of Mesopotamia and began to penetrate down into Kemet or Egypt, right? And they began to inbreed with the Africans to create the Semitic race. Now, Africa had colonized not only Europe, but they colonized the Mediterranean, right? And this colonization, they are calling enslavement. That's where the enslavement part comes in, where they said they were in bondage. No, they were not in bondage. They were colonized. You see what I'm saying? So I gotta really give it to y'all on this. And we're gonna go and we're gonna look at some more excerpts from profound scholars that's gonna show us, not just taking my word for it and my research for it, we're gonna take the word and research of those who have attained greater heights in information. You see what I'm saying? So what's important is that in the 4th century and before, there is no record of a Moses or a Pentateuch. You see what I'm saying? No record of it. No record that the founding Christian fathers had to speak on during the time that they were creating the literature, you understand, and the rudiments of Christianity. It just wasn't there. It did not exist. And my question to these apologetics, why aren't y'all debating these Jewish scholars who have attained a higher level of learning, have done the field research? You see what I'm saying? Why aren't they refuting these people? There's another book by the that's called what is that book called? Let me look it up real quick. Just 1 second. Let me look this book up real quick. The book is called The Original Torah. The Original Torah is by S. David Sperling. And in this book, he clearly speaks on that the Torah is an allegorical book. It's fictitious. No heroes, David, Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Malachi, what's the other one? Goliath, whether they be Jew or Gentile, they did not exist. See? So now you have to find the why. Go in. What is the motive? First motive, they had to write themselves into history. And if you have to write yourself into history where you didn't do anything of significance concerning and touching civilization, you see what I'm saying? You have to steal records, steal identities, and make them your own. You see what I'm saying? There's a profound scholar by the name of Ashra Kwesi. He takes people on, I would say, pilgrimage and trips to the continent of Africa and they go to the land of Egypt, the land of Kemet, and they do extreme research. You know what I'm saying? And he teaches the people of their ancestry. You see what I'm saying? And he has some excerpts on YouTube where he describes and he talks about the invasions of Kemet. And he talks about the invasion of the Hyksos or Hyksos, which in translation means shepherd kings. These particular shepherd kings were Semitic, a group of Semitic people. What is a Semite? What is a Semitic? A Semitic, according to Dr. Sheikh Anta-Diop, in his book, The African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, he describes a Semite as a mixed breed, a mixture between an African and a white person, or an Indo-European. Semite. Semi-white, semi-black. Incidentally, is also where you get the name Shem. Shemitic. Shemitic is said to come from one of the sons of Noah. That son being Shem, right? One of his 3 sons. And this particular son, from that son comes your Hebrew or your Israelites who obtain the so-called blessing, you understand me, from God, or to say they obtain the promise, right? And they became the favorites of God. They supposed to be the blessed from Shem. Why? You see what I'm saying? One thing about this page, we're gonna always establish the motive. You see what I'm saying? Because when you find motive, you find reality. You see what I'm saying? So, a Semite is a mixed breed. See what I'm saying? And from the Semitic race is where you get your Hebrew. I always ask people, what is a Hebrew? And I've been trying to talk to some Hebrew Israelites because these Hebrew Israelites have tended to adopt this Judaism. And they say that African people are their nemesis. And that African people enslaved them. Right? So, what we got to do, we got to find out the truth in that. And then we're going to go to some of these excerpts so that we can talk about the invasion of the Hyksos. Now, this is said to have happened, I would say, around, I know they occupied Kemet for about 200 years, but they got 2 different dates. Now, the earlier date, I would say, is true, because I think they were there for about 400 years, but they occupied Kemet, according to the historical record, about 200 years, right? And just like the biblical account, they came in, they were allowed in, right? And they were nomads, they were shepherds, and then they turned on African people and got together with some of their cousins. I'm thinking, I don't want to call them Persians, but Persians are a Shemitic speaking people. They turned on African people and got together with another group of invaders because they had the same culture and they spoke the same language. And they occupied Kemet and began to enslave African people up and around the area of what is said to be Egypt today. And they occupied Kemet for about 200 years until they were expelled. Now, the reason that this story of their occupation that will be found in the first 5 books of Moses is not there is because it didn't happen the way that it spoke about in the Bible. It happened a totally different way. And we're going to look at this excerpt by Dr. Ashwa Kwesi, and then we're going to see what he says about it, and then we'll speak on it.
Invasions that came into Africa. When Normer, that we dealt with earlier, we talked about Normer when he reunited Upper and Lower Egypt, first defeating the Scorpion, bringing together the first world government. But it spoke of the Asiatic invasions. Even back during his time, Egypt faced many invasions that came in by way of the Delta. These were the Asiatics.
Now, during the time of Menes, there was said to have been invasions. But there were invasions even before Menes' time. Now, Menes' time dates back, according to Drusilla Dundee, who wrote the book, The Wonderful World of the Ethiopians. This book dictates that Menes' time and his reign was about 3895 BCE. So you might as well say 4000 BCE. Now, during that particular time, there were Asiatic invasions taking place. Now, these Asiatics was coming in by way of the Delta, as you can see. And the Delta is in Lower Egypt, right before the Mediterranean Sea, right? Now, you had a group of people back during that time called the Minoans. Now, the Minoan civilization was colonized by Egypt, but they were Indo-Europeans, right? And they had adopted the culture because of this colonization. They had a temple called the Temple of Knossos, and their land was Crete, which was an island in the Cyclades in the Mediterranean, or to be more direct, the Aegean Sea. They were also called Keptu, which means pirates, right? They were described as pirates. But during that particular time, there were invasions from these Asiatic people. Now, before Menes, there were 10 Thinite kings before this first world power that was headed by Menes. And these 10 Thinite kings was during what is called the antediluvian age, which means the time before the flood. Now, let me show you how the allegory works in the Bible, because you have to be able to identify those kings, because those particular kings and the history and archaeological record of those kings were washed away once people in Africa, specific powers, decided to create an Aswan Dam, and they flooded Upper Egypt, right? And destroyed or hid and covered a lot of archaeological record. So we have to use the Bible, right? So if you know anything about the book of Genesis, Adam had a son after the death of Abel, right? Adam begets Seth, Seth begets Enos, Enos begets Canaan, Canaan begets Malil, Malil begets Jared, Jared begets Enoch, Enoch begets Methuselah, Methuselah begets Lamech, Lamech begets Noah. That's 10 kings. And if you go back to the book of Genesis, these particular personages were profound individuals, right? And they lived up to and including about 1,000 years, right? The only one that didn't live that long, it was one of them that didn't live that long. But if you add up their years, incidentally, it's about 10,000 years per person. That's how the Bible, in its allegorical form, is written. Because we know no human being lives 1,000 years, right? So, these invaders are a Semitic branch of Indo-Europeans. Well, not Indo-Europeans, but as a result of the misogyny of Africans and whites, that created your Shemitic branch. And these mixed breeds were causing havoc all through the land, coming in by way of the Nile Delta. This is what the master teacher Ashwakwezi is referring to. Let's keep going. Hold on. Before we move forward, we got to deal with Scorpion. Scorpion, who Menes went to war with, was a pharaoh in lower Egypt. And I put my bottom dollar on it, that Scorpion had become cosmopolitan with the invaders, which caused a rift in the society. So in order to reunify Kemet, war was waged against Scorpion, and Menes came out victorious.
That you see right here. Now, as I mentioned before, the Asiatics who came across the Sinai. So here we see the earliest recording of these people who came in and settled with us for a while, till they built in numbers, and then eventually attacking Egypt. This is again from Khnum-Hotep's tomb from the 12th dynastic period, right during the time of Amenhotep III. Here again, Manethos talks about, now you can see the Hyksos who came into Egypt, and Manethos said, unexpectedly from the region of the east came men of unknown race. Confident of the victory, they marched against our land. By force they took it easy without a single battle. Having overpowered our rulers, they burned our cities without compassion and destroyed the temples. All the people were treated with great cruelty, for they slew some and carried off the wives and children of others into slavery. Doesn't that sound like a familiar account? This period is documented around 1650 or 1750, right around the same time of Abraham. Now, take a good look of the pictures that I showed earlier too. These were the Hyksos that you see right here. These were the invaders, just as you see them carved in stone right here. These are the people who came out of the Sinai. Some say from Mitanni, some say they were Hurrians. These are the Temerians who were indigenous to the Nile Valley, as well as the Ta-Nehisian brothers who were further up in the southern part of Egypt, or Kemet, ancient Ethiopia as some would call it. These were the Tamahu people who invaded from Libya from the west. They attacked Egypt after the 6th dynastic period. Now, it was this brother that we showed again, Ahmose I, who finally expelled them out of our land. Now, I'm showing this in reference with the temple, how our ancestors, you're witnessing, recording these people who came into our land, who invaded until Ahmose I finally expelled them. We want to give you documented evidence to show you that we were at war with these people who invaded our land. We did not have anyone enslaved, but in fact, the Hyksos enslaved us for 200 years. If we deal with the 21st dynasty, 22nd dynasty, 23rd dynasty, these were all Asiatic. Shishak, that Badawi will show us in a little while, he was also of Asiatic origin. So again, indigenous African Kemetic people were not even on the throne then. This is why this is so important to understand this in the Bible, because by looking at the Bible in America and the Western world, they look at this as all being part of Egypt. Not saying that we were enslaved ourselves by these Asiatic people. And the same people who are ruling us today, who are exploiting us out of our minds, are the same people who invaded our land long ago, who came in even during the time of the 12th dynastic period, right after Amenhotep. and we called them the troglodytes who came out of the desert. How can we dispute this documented evidence, documented information? But
there's no disputing documented record. And the ancestors documented in stone. And as you can see, he's showing the reliefs, showing the evidence, the documentation of our people at war and at conflict with these Asiatics that were coming in 3,000 years ago, all the way up to the 6th dynastic period, where the people who came in then were the Tamahu. To be more correct and direct, they were your full whites, right? Tamahu means created people, right? Then you had the Semites coming in that were more destructive and more devastating, I believe, because of their mixed breed heritage, right? They were sheep herders, and they were despised by African people, right? They continued to come in and invade around the 12th dynasty, right? And from this time period of destabilization, right, they began to grow in numbers. And as those numbers grew, Kemet was being more unstable, right? So these people were called troglodytes. Troglodyte is a troll. That's where your term troll comes from, right? So around about the 17th dynastic period, where you had a dynasty that was headed by one pharaoh called Second Enrei-Tau. He had two sons, Kakmosi and Akmosi. Akmosi became the liberator, and he cast the Hyksos out of Kemet. And what they did, they went from Kemet to the land of Canaan. And that's where they set up Jerusalem, right? And from that, they took everything that they had learned culturally, especially the religious political system, and they created what we know today as Judaism, right? But the literature for Judaism had not been written yet, right? They just absorbed the culture and began to live according to African civilized thought and civilized ways. You see what I'm saying? So the allegory in this is the fact that these shepherd kings, these Hyksos, these Semitic people began to migrate into the land of Kemet. And as you heard the master teacher say, they took the ground without a battle. How in the world did they take ground without having one battle? That shows you that Lower Kemet was saturated with them. And over the years, they had begun to gain political authority in the land. They had to have gained that amount of power for them not to have had one battle to take over Lower Kemet, right? So, the Hyksos ruled in Lower Kemet and had a capital called Avaris, and they were there, according to some sources, only 200 years. But I believe they were there for the 400 years that the Bible talks about, because the author Drusilla Dundee, who wrote the book again, The Wonderful World of the Cushites of the Ethiopian Empire, she says that they were there about 400 to 500 years, which clearly mirrors the falsified fact that they were slaves in Kemet for 400 years. No, that's the discrepancy. They were not slaves. They were invaders, and they enslaved our people, taking our wives, taking our women, taking our children, enslaving them and misogynizing them so that they can pretty much use them as weapons against our people, right? To continue to gain political power. Let's keep going.
Many years, brothers and sisters, returned back with us on the Kemet New Know Thyself educational tour to see an eyewitness account what our ancestors wrote for us on the temples and tombs, which are books in stone, that now end up in many of the biblical stories today. Let's continue with the live lecture. These are the people who enslaved our people. These people set up in an area of Kemet and Lower Kemet called Avaris, took over and were enslaving the Africans for over 200 years until Second Enrei-Tao of the 17th dynasty, and it is he who waged war on the battlefield, and his life was lost on the battlefield, and it was his son Thutmose who continued the battle until his son Thutmose, who opened up the 18th dynasty. This is a real person, brothers and sisters, who said never again. He was the liberator, the emancipator, who kicked these Hyksos out of our land. This is the real historical account that we've got to start teaching our people, brothers and sisters. So they took from this African right here his name Thutmose and made a Moses. This is the only account that we expelled a large group of people out of our land, this African right here who opened up the 18th dynasty known as the Golden Age. This is the historical account, brothers and sisters. In fact, let's go into another warrior soldier as we see in his name, Men-Kepera, Tahuti Mays. He had 17 battles and won them all. He also wanted to make sure that these Hyksos were not going to come into our land. Here you see Men-Kepera's battle, showing where he's battling the Hyksos. Look at some of them hiding behind trees as cowards right here. This is the story that our ancestors left us in stone, as though they knew that one day we would forget our story. Here's the battle of Men-Kepera, who battled and wanted to make sure these Hyksos were not going to come into our land. In fact, this brother, he made sure that he even educated these people he was conquering into the Kemetic history, okay, initiated them into make sure that they will keep control of people that they're conquering. So that brother was brilliant. In fact, he put a whooping on a city so bad called Megiddo. Do you know this is where the name Armageddon came from, Megiddo right here? That's where the origin of that name came from. But this is the brother, Ursama At Rasab Tepen Rawa Mesumori Amen, a little practice you can say it too. He also had to fight some people called the Hittites. See, we're constantly at war with these people coming from the north, brothers and sisters. We left the reliefs over 3,000 years ago carved in stone. In fact, there's one story right here where Ursama At Ra told his generals, he said, cut off the right hand of the enemy. But he noticed that the right hand and the left hand was turning up. He told them to cut off the right hand to make sure that they weren't cowards. So he said, the enemy only has one thing I know they got, and that's the penis, the foreskin. So he told them to cut off the foreskin, and that's what you see right here, the foreskin right here. These are stories and accounts that's carved on these temples, brothers and sisters. Our story is here. Now, what does that have to do with the scriptures? Well, let's go to Samuel, and it talks about David wants to marry the daughter of Saul. So Saul tells him to go and do what? Cut off the foreskin of the Philistines, as it says in Samuel chapter 18, verse 27. Wherefore David arose and went, and he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men, and David brought their foreskins, and they gave them the full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. So here you got it written here in Saul, but long before Saul, our ancestors cut off the foreskin, where Mesu told his generals to cut off the right hand, and he noticed right and left hands were turning up, and he told them to cut off the foreskins, where it ended up in Saul in the Bible. What makes somebody who just put it on some paper versus that which is carved in stone? Spiritual enslavement.
You see how the Hyksos stole the story of our people that we have carved in stone, illustrating the happenings, the encounters, the wars that the pharaohs and their armies had with the Hyksos, the Asiatics, the people that came out of the desert, the troglodytes. The story in particular about the foreskin in the right hands, in the left hands, both hands showing up, carved in stone. And if you know anything about the story of David in the Bible, when he was trying to prove himself to Saul, the story goes, he wanted to marry Saul's daughter. And in so desiring, he was told to cut off a certain amount of foreskins of the enemy. Right? Which people were they? They were the Philistines. He cut off all of the enemy's foreskin, and he cut off more than what was required in order to prove himself to Saul. That particular story ended up in the Bible, but the truth of that history happened between African people and the Hittite forces, were Ramesu, or who they call Ramses, his holy royal name, Ursama Ra Septepen Ra Ramesu Muri Amen, of the 19th dynasty, carved that story in stone, where he sent his generals to send their army to inflict that type of pain in warfare against the Hittite forces, their enemies. The Hittite forces were Indo-Europeans, right? You got the Hyksos, who were cast out of Kemet after occupying Kemet, they say for 200 years, right? Now, the story of the Bible, you know that Abraham went to sojourn in Egypt, and he told the Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister. And if you're not aware in the Bible, you would think that Abraham was acting righteously when he actually wasn't. He lied to the Pharaoh in order to lead us to believe that he, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, wanted to take his wife from him. But that wasn't the case. He desired her because of her beauty, and because he thought that was his sister due to his lie. He wanted to come to an agreement with him, and it was a friendly gesture to take Sarah as his wife. But once he found out that that was his wife and not his sister, he immediately said, "What is this that thou hast done to us? Take your wife and leave our land. And here, take this and take that." That's a very, very manipulative story and a manipulative way for Abraham to have acted in the land of Egypt. But because we're so mesmerized about this God-chosen people, we look over the wickedness that is enacted by the children of Israel, right? But in any case, Abraham sojourned there. Isaac sojourned there. Jacob ended up going there. This illustrates all of the time periods where one man out of those characters takes his people to sojourn in Egypt. That illustrates all of the times that is documented historically that the Semitic races, of Hyksos, other Indo-European people coming into the land of Canaan, not the land of Canaan, coming into the land of Egypt, sojourning, invading, right? And then taking power and enslaving African people. That's your allegory, right? So many different areas. But if you don't know history, you have no way to distinguish the truth of what's really going on. The story of Joseph coming into the land of Canaan. Coming into the land of Egypt as a slave, being sold into slavery by his own brothers, right? And then miraculously by God elevated to a position of pharaonic power. He literally became the Pharaoh. Him becoming the Pharaoh illustrates the true history of shepherd kings, Hyksos, coming into the land and taking power. Clear cut and dry. You see what I'm saying? But they're not going to teach you this in church. The Khazars and the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the descendants of these people, they remember, they know the history. So what they did was, once they established their lives and intelligence and civilization, they began to write their history in allegorical format and attested these stories to God and themselves. You see what I'm saying? Very shrewd, as they are today, very shrewd way of writing so-called history and incarnating. I love the fact that Dr. Walter Williams calls it incarnated names. People who they just make up. But one very, very pivotal point in this, right, is the fact that they took the story of Akhmoset, a very prominent name amongst the Egyptians, and they made the liberator of Egypt into the Moses of the Bible, when actually Akhmoset expelled them out of Egypt, and they created a character called Moses, right? Turned the story around and said that they were led by their Moses out of bondage, demonizing ancient Kemet, demonizing, and then created all of these stories of wandering in the desert 40 years and the parting of the Red Sea and Pharaoh chasing after them and being swallowed up in the sea, and things that are impossible, right? In the book of Jasher, illustrates in a place where Joseph was taught all of the languages of mankind in one night. And that's how, taught by God now, and that's how he was chosen to become Pharaoh of Egypt. In the book of Jasher, Sefer HaYasa literature, he became the Pharaoh, not just governor. You see what I'm saying? But if you don't have that book, if you never read that book, you'll never know this. You'll never see this. It illustrates wars and the sons of Jacob going to war and doing things like leaping over buildings and like supernatural things physically. All of this stuff is in the book of Jasher, and they described it as the wars of God, you know. But it's amazing how when you search through the archaeological record of the ancestors and you read the Bible and you're able to sift through what's clearly unreal and you put it next to what was real, you can see with an overwhelmingly amount of proof that the true stories and the true history is in the archaic record of Kemet. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel. When we get back, man, we're gonna dive into some other areas of the Bible to show what the allegory is parallel with in the true documented history of ancient Kemet.